Colombia has suffered one of the longest civil wars in history. Over 50 years of armed conflict with thousands of people tortured, disappeared and slaughtered, and millions displaced. It remains the most dangerous place in the world to be a trade unionist, and human rights defenders and social leaders have been and still are being murdered with impunity. The armed conflict was a result of a deep-rooted social and political conflict. Despite its huge natural wealth, many Colombians live in poverty. Wealth is concentrated in the hands of very few people who wield enormous political power, and they also own large sections of the media. These people are concentrated in the urban areas that represent a tiny proportion of Colombia's landmass. The Colombian state, right-wing paramilitaries and guerrillas waged that decades-long war that none could or would ever win. So when in 2012 the peace negotiations began, overseen by the UN, there was a glimmer of hope. And as someone who has campaigned on behalf of trade unionists, human rights defenders and social leaders for well over a decade, I felt that finally there might be a small chance for the Colombian people to live in safety in the future. Of course I'll give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, congratulate her on securing this debate and indeed commend her campaigning on this over many years. Would you agree with me that there is a real concern at the moment, reading and hearing about the killing of community leaders in rural areas? This must stop. The peace must be enforced, and that peace that we do have is precious and has to be continued and secured.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and the spike and increase in the numbers of civilians being murdered and the lack of any prosecutions and convictions is one of the reasons why the peace process implementation is so fragile at the moment. Now, no one doubts the challenging circumstances in which those negotiations took place. In fact, politicians from Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, through work by the NGO Justice for Colombia, helped share their knowledge and experience of the Northern Ireland peace process and the Good Friday Agreement with the Colombian government and with the FARC so that they could benefit from the lessons that had been learned. And after 4 years of negotiation in August 2016, the Colombian government and the FARC announced the final peace agreement. A bilateral ceasefire took place, there was then disarmament by the FARC, and the FARC became a legitimate, legal, political party. The peace agreement was put to a vote of the Colombian people, but one of the most outspoken critics of the deal was former President Alvaro Uribe, who had been in power between 2002 and 2010, when some of the worst atrocities against trade unionists and human rights defenders were committed by the state and state-backed right-wing paramilitaries. Of course I'll give way, sorry.
I thank her. Sorry to interrupt her. One of the groups of victims at this point were people who had suffered sexual violence in conflict. Now, I know that the British Embassy in Bogotá had started a human rights programme. Has she assessed how successful that has been in dealing with those people who had suffered from sexual violence in conflict?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for raising that point, and it's something on which I hope the Minister will be able to elaborate in his response to the debate, because obviously the UK and Colombia are friends. We wield enormous influence over what goes on in Colombia, and certainly that's one of the programmes that I hope will be continuing so that we can ensure that that particular group of victims do not suffer further. Going back to President Uribe, he co-founded a new political party, the Centro Democrático, the Democratic Centre, in 2013, largely to oppose the peace process in the 2014 Colombian elections. And despite the extremely narrow rejection in that plebiscite of the peace agreement, a revised agreement was shortly after ratified by the Colombian Congress in 2016. Now, that final agreement, for which the UK is the penholder on behalf of the UN Security Council, was structured around 6 areas. Firstly, comprehensive rural land reform. The government promised to provide 3 million hectares of land to the landless or land-poor peasants and to formalise legal property title on another 7 million hectares, in addition to heavily investing in infrastructure projects and state building in what were previously FARC-controlled areas. The second point was political participation. As I said previously, the FARC became a legal political party, and it was guaranteed a minimum of 5 seats in Congress and 5 seats in the House of Representatives for 2 legislative terms starting in 2018. After that point, the FARC will then have to win seats competitively in elections. The third area was the ending of the conflict, disarmament of the FARC, transition to civilian life and reincorporation, and guaranteed security conditions for former combatants and communities in UN-monitored reincorporation zones. And I visited one of those zones, a specific camp in Filipinas in the Arauca region on the northeastern border with Venezuela in August last year, and saw what little progress there had been made in terms of establishing those zones and being able to take former combatants to get them to a position where they could make a living and fend for themselves. The fourth area is ending the drug trade, which obviously has an impact in terms of drug consumption in the UK, cocaine being a particular topical point at the moment. The crop substitution programme with the government and the FARC helping farmers to stop growing coca and to instead grow legal crops to make a living and grow their local economies. The fifth point, justice for victims of the conflict, which the Honourable Gentleman has just touched on. A transitional justice system called the HEP, JEP, would be established. Special tribunals would adjudicate war crimes and other atrocities committed by government security forces, paramilitaries and guerrillas, with reduced sentences for those who came forward. And the emphasis of the HEP would be on restorative justice and ensuring the rights of victims. And then the final area was on implementation and verification of the peace agreement, which is a really critical part. The UN Special Political Verification Mission would take an oversight role, and there would also be set up a commission known by its Spanish acronym, CSIVI, which consisted of 3 senior government and 3 senior FARC members to follow up the implementation process. And at first, the peace agreement implementation seemed to be working. There was a significant drop in violence in 2017, Colombia's safest recorded year since 1975. However, there was a very significant change in direction in 2018 with the election of Iván Duque as the new president. He is a protégé of Uribe. He ran on a platform of dismantling parts of the agreement, particularly in relation to political participation by the FARC and the work of the HEP. And since his election, he has systematically attempted to undermine the HEP, despite it being recognised by the international community and, most importantly, by the victims of the conflict, as a way to provide truth, justice and reconciliation for victims of all sides and an end to the impunity that has operated for decades. And this has resulted in a significant stalling of the process that is threatening the very existence of the peace agreement. We are the largest second investor in Colombia after the United States, and as penholder to the peace agreement, we play a particular role in this process. The UN Security Council warned on the 16th of April this year that the peace process, and I quote, stands at a critical juncture. All of the sections of the peace agreement are crucially important, but I just want to focus a few remarks on 3 of them: ending the conflict, political participation and the role of the HEP. 1/3 of the peace agreement's 578 stipulations have not even begun to be implemented, and an estimated 1,700 former guerrillas have returned to armed struggle. And the arrival of President Duque here in London yesterday is very timely, and I know that the Minister is meeting the President later today. So I hope that, as well as me, many members on this side will have questions that the Minister and issues that the Minister can raise with President Duque when he sees him. So on the armed conflict, since the signing of the agreement, Colombian human rights organisations estimate that 591 social leaders have been assassinated, and 236 of these have happened in the 10 months since the President took office. Of course I'll give way.
I'm grateful for Honourable Friend for giving way, and she will know that I went on delegations to Colombia in 2007 when Uribe was still in power, and in 2012, and we heard widespread evidence of human rights abuses. And I'm really disappointed to hear that slow progress has been made with the peace process. Does she agree with me that it's time for our government to step up and to work with human rights defenders to bring about a country-specific plan to protect human rights defenders in Colombia?
my honourable friend is absolutely right, and one of the questions I have for the Minister is around the help that we have been giving to the Colombian government and to their sort of Department of Justice about training their lawyers around investigation and disclosure, and why that doesn't seem to be working, because impunity continues. An estimated 135 former FARC combatants have been murdered since they laid down their weapons in the disarmament process. One of the most recent victims was Dimar Torres, who is alleged to have been murdered by Colombian soldiers, and the local community then found his body next to a recently dug grave, raising suspicions that the soldiers were attempting to disappear his body, which is what we've seen over years and years and years prior to the signing of the peace agreement. A recent statement by the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions and the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearances has urged the Colombian government to, and I quote, cease inciting violence against demobilised individuals of the FARC and to meet the guarantees that were made to them during the negotiations in Havana, most importantly, respect for the right to life. Yet the minister responsible for peace implementation, Emilio Archila, reacted to this by responding that the statement was, quote, badly intentioned, unquote, and rejected their conclusions. Former President Uribe attacked the UN on his Twitter account. This all follows New York Times revelations in late May that the army has reinstated orders to soldiers to show results, so performance-related pay and results in the killing of armed groups. It's a chilling reminder of the military's involvement in the false positives scandal under Uribe's administration, during which thousands of civilians were murdered by the military and then presented as if they had been guerrilla fighters killed in combat, dressed up in army fatigues. After a huge outcry, the Ministry of Defence in Colombia said they would amend the orders, but concerns obviously still remain. And last week, the Senate voted to promote General Martinez Espinel, despite him being second in command of a brigade accused of murdering 23 civilians between 2004 and 2006 in that particular method. Recently, the Colombian government have claimed that there's been a 32% reduction in killings of social leaders, but this is in direct contravention of the evidence from the many reports of human rights organisations on the ground. Uribe recently said that 5,000 FARC members had returned to the mountains. This is a coded reference to them taking up arms again. But this is a completely fake claim. There is no evidence to substantiate it. It's not supported by anyone involved in the monitoring of the peace process, and it's a deliberate strategy by Uribe, who is the figurehead of President Duque's party, to undermine implementation of the peace process and the UN verification mission. And I think, in turn, that undermines Britain's role as the penholder for this agreement. And yesterday, at his presentation at Canning House, President Duque made no reference to human rights abuses and the targeting of social leaders in Colombia. My second of the 3 points is on the HEP. Implementation has been resisted by Duque's administration, who see it as too lenient and treading on the toes of the criminal justice system. And in March this year, the statutory law, which would provide the legal framework for the HEP, was stalled after President Duque refused to sign it off, citing concern with 6 articles. There followed a lengthy legislative battle. The law was eventually signed into place this month after Congress and the Constitutional Court rejected President Duque's changes. But I think that his resistance to such a fundamental part of the peace agreement should be a very concerning warning to our government about his attitude and disdain towards the agreement. And the case of Congressman Jesús Santrich, which the Minister knows I have taken an active interest in, perfectly illustrates the genuine concerns in Colombia and internationally about President Duque's commitment to the agreement, and particularly to the HEP. There is no doubt, in my view, that there's been political interference in the HEP by the Colombian government, most notably by the actions of former Attorney General Néstor Humberto Martinez, who recently resigned following the long-awaited release of Congressman Santrich from prison. Jesús Santrich was a key negotiator of the Colombian peace agreement, a member of the FARC delegation to the negotiations, and an architect of the agreement. At the time of his arrest in April 2018, he was a member of the CSIVI, that implementation committee I mentioned earlier. He was due to take his seat in the House of Representatives in July last year as part of the FARC's 10 representatives in the Colombian Congress, a specific part of the peace agreement. But he was arrested in April last year on the order of an international arrest warrant issued by a New York court requesting extradition. It was alleged that he had conspired to smuggle 10 tons of cocaine out of Colombia in an aeroplane. He categorically denies the accusation, but he was imprisoned in solitary confinement in La Picota high security prison in Bogotá. And last August, I went to visit him in his prison cell. He is blind, he suffers from a degenerative eye condition, so it's so severe that his sight is almost non-existent, and he has other significant and major health problems. Santrich spent 13 months in La Picota, during which time he undertook a lengthy hunger strike to draw attention to his plight, and when I met him, he was extremely frail, in declining health, and he was being refused access to essential medical care. No adjustments were being made to accommodate his disability. And when I came back to the UK, I had a meeting with the Minister, and I'm pleased to say that shortly afterwards, some disability aids were provided to Congressman Santrich. But at no point was any evidence disclosed to his lawyers to back up the allegations made against him and on which basis the warrant had been issued. So he, since then, has presented his case to the HEP, arguing that it had jurisdiction to hear it rather than the Colombian Criminal Court, which the then Attorney General challenged and lost. The Attorney General was asked by the HEP to provide the evidence that substantiated imprisonment and proposed extradition. None was forthcoming. Neither did the US Department of Justice provide any evidence. On the 15th of May this year, the HEP gave its ruling, guaranteeing that there would be no extradition, and they ordered that Jesús Santrich should be freed from prison. The Colombian Procurator's Office appealed the decision. The HEP insisted on release, but the Attorney General refused to sign the order for release and has since resigned, saying that he's not prepared to do so. Jesús Santrich was kept in prison until the 19th of May, and on his arrival outside the prison gates, he was immediately rearrested and taken in a helicopter to the Attorney General's building. And 10 days later, 29th of May, the Supreme Court ordered his release, and he was eventually sworn into office as Congressman on the 11th of June. I went into detail on that because this entire process has been carried out in the context of strong opposition by the government party to the HEP. It's been a deliberate attempt to diminish the authority of the HEP, and it has wide-ranging consequences for its proper functioning and authority. And it's no surprise that the case has caused huge concern amongst defenders of the peace process, which adds to the considerable concerns about the lack of implementation of the process and the rise in the murders of civilians and the continuing impunity. So Santrich is someone who was a key member of the negotiating team, someone who's due to be in Congress, occupying one of those 10 guaranteed seats. He has become symbolic for this peace process. And that's why I hope tonight the Minister will seek an explanation from President Duque about his government's conduct in this case, particularly that of the former Attorney General, and to ask what reassurances can be given about Jesús Santrich's freedom in the future and ability to carry out his democratic role. And finally, for the Minister, I'll go back to the point following the intervention from my honourable friend about the role of the UK in assisting. I think it's the Fiscalia that we have been helping in terms of investigating, learning about investigation and disclosure, and support we have given. Certainly, I know it's been raised in debates in the past. If this is what we are still doing, why are we doing it when the HEP is being politicised and abused in this way?